The night the factory whistle went silent, the whole town felt like it stopped breathing. Snow drifted against boarded windows. Street lights buzzed like tired bees, and the parking lot outside the old mill looked like a graveyard of rusted cars. Inside a small rented room above a laundromat, a young man sat on the edge of his mattress with both hands pressed to his face, trying to hold himself together. The letter on the table said the same thing in cold, printed words that thousands of families were reading that week. Layoffs, effective immediately. But the truth was louder than any letter. The truth was the sound of a future collapsing in a place where people had already learned to live with less. His name was Ethan Caldwell, and he had grown up believing in two things: work and dignity. He believed that if you showed up early, stayed late, and did what you promised, life would meet you halfway. That was what his father told him before an accident took his father's strength, and then took his father's job, and then, slowly, took the light from his eyes. Ethan had watched his mother stretch grocery money with quiet miracles, watched his neighbors trade favors like currency, watched good men drink their pride away because they didn't know what else to do with it. He promised himself he would never be helpless. Yet here he was, 26 years old, staring at a letter that made him feel like the world had decided he was disposable. Outside, the wind carried the smell of cold metal and chimney smoke. Ethan walked down the stairs and into the dark like a man stepping out of a story he no longer recognized. He crossed the street to the diner that stayed open late for people who didn't want to go home and face their own thoughts. He sat alone in a booth, eyes fixed on the steam rising from a cup of coffee he could barely afford. His hands were rough from the mill. His shoulders were heavy with responsibility, and behind his ribs fear kept tapping like a warning. He didn't know how to rebuild something when the ground beneath him had cracked. If you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because stories like this are for anyone who's ever been knocked down and needed a reason to stand back up. Ethan wasn't the only one. The diner was full of silence dressed up as casual conversation. Men stared at their plates. Women spoke softly, careful not to let their panic spill. A teenager in a school jacket wiped tables, eyes darting as if he could sense the grown-up dread in the air. Everyone pretended they were fine, because pretending was sometimes the only thing holding a person upright. Ethan stared out the window at the mill's dark outline on the hill, a giant shadow against the sky. It felt impossible that something so massive could simply stop, as if the town's heartbeat had been switched off. The next morning he did what he always did when he felt lost. He got up early. He washed his face. He put on his work boots like a ritual, even though he had nowhere to go. He walked through town, past the closed storefronts, and for lease signs, past porches where old flags hung faded and frayed. He stopped by his mother's apartment, where she was already up, already moving, already doing the quiet work of survival. She didn't cry when he told her. She didn't collapse. She just nodded, like she had expected life to be cruel. And then she placed a hand on his shoulder that somehow weighed more than the whole world. He spent the next weeks searching. He filled out applications until his handwriting looked like someone else's. He drove to neighboring towns and sat in waiting rooms that smelled like stale air and disappointment. He took temporary jobs, day labor, anything. But in a place where everyone was desperate, opportunity became a thin thread that snapped easily. His savings drained fast. His pride drained faster. The nights grew colder. The world grew quieter. And inside him, the belief he once held began to dim. Not all at once, but like a lamp, losing power. One afternoon, when the sky was the color of wet cement, Ethan found himself at the public library, the warmest building in town that didn't ask you to spend money. He wasn't there for books at first. He was there for heat and time. Somewhere to sit and breathe without counting pennies. He walked between shelves and listened to the hush. On a table near the back, An elderly man was sorting through old newspapers, careful and slow, as if each page carried something fragile. The man wore a worn coat and had hands that looked like they had built things. His eyes were sharp, though, and when he noticed Ethan hovering, he gave a small nod, like he recognized that look on a young person's face. Ethan sat at a nearby table and opened a book at random, pretending to read, but the words wouldn't stick. His mind kept replaying all the ways he had failed, all the ways life had proven him naive. The older man finally spoke in a quiet voice, not as an interruption, but as an invitation. But as an interruption, but as an interruption. He mentioned that the library had old archives, stories of the town from decades before, stories of hardship and rebuilding, stories of people who had lost everything and still kept moving forward. Ethan didn't respond much. He didn't feel like a story could feed him or pay his rent. Yet something about the way the man handled those pages, like they mattered, made Ethan curious. He began coming back. At first it was just to escape the cold. Then it became something else. He sat with those old newspapers and read about the town's first mill, built by immigrants who didn't speak the language well, but understood the meaning of hope. He read about dust storms in distant states, families traveling with nothing but faith and grit. He read about wars that took sons and left fathers broken, and communities that still rebuilt homes and lives with bare hands. The words weren't romantic. They were heavy. They described hunger, loss, and fear. But woven through them was something Ethan had forgotten. People survived not because life was fair, but because they refused to surrender their spirit. The elderly man's name was Mr. Holloway. He had been a machinist, then a supervisor, then the kind of person who quietly helped young workers learn skills without embarrassing them. He didn't lecture. He didn't preach. He simply listened when Ethan talked about the mill, about his father, about feeling like he had been handed a future and then watched it get snatched away. Mr. Holloway spoke about how the country had been built by people who kept believing in themselves, even when the world gave them no proof they should. Not belief as a slogan, but belief as a decision made every morning, to stand up, to try again, to do one more honest thing. Ethan started to feel something unfamiliar, a small ember of purpose. It didn't solve his problems. It didn't erase his debt or fill his refrigerator, but it reminded him he wasn't powerless. He had hands, he had a mind, he had discipline. And he had a mind, he had discipline. And he had a story that didn't have to end in defeat. The turning point didn't come in a dramatic moment with fireworks. It came in a small, ordinary day, when Ethan was walking past the closed mill and saw a for sale sign on a neighboring warehouse. The building was old, but the bones were strong. Inside, dusty sunlight cut through broken windows. Ethan stood there, breathing in the smell of oil and wood, and imagined something new living there, something not owned by distant executives, something rooted in the town's own hands. He didn't have money. He didn't have investors. He didn't have connections. But he had an idea that felt like it belonged to him. A small workshop that could take scrap and create practical tools and repairs for local farms and businesses. Things people always needed, especially when times were hard. He thought of his father's old toolbox, the way his father used to fix things for neighbors without expecting payment, just respect. Ethan thought of the younger men in town who needed work, and the older men who still carried skills like treasure. The first person he told was his mother. She looked at him with that same steady gaze, then asked the questions that mattered. How, when? What will you sacrifice, and are you ready to suffer for this the way you suffered for that mill? Ethan didn't answer with confidence. He answered with honesty. He said he was tired of waiting for someone else to save them. He was tired of feeling like his life belonged to decisions made in faraway boardrooms. He said he wanted to build something that couldn't be taken away so easily, something that would give him dignity again. His mother nodded, and in her eyes, He saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Pride. Ethan went back to the library and asked Mr. Holloway what it took to start a workshop. The old man didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss him. He pulled out a notebook and began listing what Ethan would need. Pay. Ramit's basic equipment, safety, a small plan, and most of all, patience. He warned Ethan that believing in yourself wasn't a magical shield. It was a muscle you trained by doing hard things repeatedly. He said Ethan would face rejection and humiliation. He would be tempted to quit. He would wake up some mornings feeling foolish. But if he wanted a life built by his own hands, he had to accept the cost. Ethan began. He started small, too small to impress anyone. He posted simple flyers offering repairs. Farm gates, machinery parts, broken hinges, anything metal could fix. He used borrowed tools, then tools bought from pawn shops. He worked out of a corner in a friend's garage. He counted every dollar. He skipped meals sometimes without telling anyone. He wore the same jacket through the winter until the cuffs frayed, but he kept going. His first big job came from a farmer whose equipment had broken right before a storm. Ethan stayed up all night, working under a single hanging bulb, hands shaking with exhaustion. When he delivered the repaired part at dawn, the farmer stared at it like Ethan had handed him a lifeline. The payment wasn't huge, but it was proof. It was evidence that Ethan's work mattered to someone. He drove home with the sun rising behind him, and for the first time in months, he felt his chest expand with something close to hope. Work began to trickle in. The town, hungry for reasons to believe in itself, noticed the young man who refused to leave. People started recommending him. An old mechanic offered advice. A retired welder showed him a better technique. A woman who ran a small cafe began saving him leftovers at closing time. Not out of pity, but out of solidarity. Ethan realized the spirit that built America wasn't just about lone heroes. It was about communities of ordinary people who carried each other when the road got steep. The Warehouse B came possible when a local credit union manager, someone who knew Ethan's family, agreed to meet. Ethan walked into that office, with hands sweating, heart pounding, and a folder full of numbers that still felt too fragile to stand on. The manager didn't promise miracles. He asked for a plan, and for proof that Ethan would not run when things got hard. Ethan spoke about the town, about skills being wasted, about building something local and real. He spoke like a man who had been broken and decided to be rebuilt. The manager listened, then offered a small loan with strict terms. It wasn't easy money. It was faith, measured out in cautious dollars. Ethan signed the papers with a hand that trembled. He didn't celebrate. He went straight to the warehouse and began cleaning. He hauled trash. He patched leaks. He painted walls. He brought in second-hand equipment. The first time he turned on the lights and saw the space glowing, he stood still and let the feeling hit him. It wasn't just a building. It was a promise made visible. He hired one person first, an old friend who had been sleeping on his cousin's couch. Then he hired another, a man with a family who had been scraping by. The shop was loud with machines, but it was also loud with life. It became a place where people walked in with broken things and walked out with something repaired, something usable, something saved. Each repair felt like a metaphor the town could understand. But success didn't come without pain. There were weeks when orders slowed, and Ethan stared at bills like they were enemies. There were nights he lay awake fearing he would fail and take others down with him. There were times when equipment broke, when mistakes cost money they didn't have, when doubt surged like a flood. In those moments, Ethan remembered what Mr. Holloway said. Belief is a decision, not a feeling, a decision. So Ethan got up, apologized when he was wrong, learned what he needed to learn, and kept showing up. One spring evening, after a long day, Ethan drove to the cemetery where his father was buried. The grass was soft, and the air smelled like rain and new leaves. Ethan stood in front of the headstone and let the quiet settle into him. He thought about the boy he used to be, the boy who believed the world was fair if you worked hard enough. He thought about the man he had become, someone who understood that fairness wasn't guaranteed, but effort still mattered. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor. He felt like someone who had finally learned what strength really was. He left the cemetery and drove through town. The storefronts were still worn, but a few new lights had appeared. A small bakery had reopened. A mechanic shop had expanded. People walked with a little more purpose. It wasn't a perfect recovery, but it was a beginning. And in the center of it, Ethan's workshop hummed, a steady heartbeat in a town that had once gone silent. Near the end of that year, Mr. Study Holloway came by the shop. He stood quietly watching the younger workers move with confidence, watching Ethan check measurements, solve problems, and encourage others without needing applause. The old man's face carried the soft satisfaction of someone who had seen a seed become a tree. Ethan didn't need words to understand what the moment meant. It wasn't approval from a corporation. It wasn't fame. It was something better. The respect of a community and the knowledge that he had built something real. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, because your support helps these messages reach people who are struggling quietly and need a reminder that their spirit still matters. Ethan didn't become rich overnight. He didn't escape hardship forever. Life still tested him because life always does. But he stopped being afraid of the tests. He learned that the spirit that built America was never about easy roads. It was about ordinary people choosing courage in small moments, choosing to try again after failure, choosing to serve others even when they were tired, choosing to believe in themselves when no one else could see the dream yet. And before this story fully ends, leave a comment with the words "I believe" if you're still fighting for your own future, because someone out there needs to see they're not alone. In the end, Ethan's victory wasn't the building, the loan, or the machines. It was the quiet transformation inside him. He began as a man crushed by a closed factory and a broken promise. He became a man who understood that hope isn't something you wait for, it's something you build. One honest day at a time, one decision at a time, one act of belief at a time. And as the workshop lights glowed in the evening, shining on hands that worked and lives that healed, the town remembered something it had nearly lost: the power of a spirit that refuses to quit.